Every Memorial Day since 2015, a single white wreath appears at the same grave in St. Augustine Memorial Cemetery. No one sees who leaves it. No security camera ever catches the delivery. And no one who works the grounds claims responsibility. It's always placed at exactly midnight, centered perfectly, always fresh, and always whispering. Yes, whispering. The first person to notice this was a volunteer groundskeeper named Celia, who worked the early morning shifts during Memorial Week. She reported hearing a strange, fluttering sound as she approached the grave, followed by what she described as the sound of dry voices, like wind through pages. At first, she assumed it was in her head, but when she bent down to adjust the wreath one morning, she swore it whispered her name. Celia never returned to the job. No official complaint, no resignation. Just an unread voicemail to her manager saying, "I know what it's saying now." It's not just a voice, it's a memory. The grave in question belongs to Lieutenant David Marston, a young soldier who served in Afghanistan and died in 2009 under mysterious circumstances. Officially, his death was ruled an accident, an IED that detonated unexpectedly during a night patrol. But several reports hint that something was off. Survivors in his unit said he'd been acting strangely in the days before his death, speaking to people who weren't there, asking his fellow soldiers if they heard the children singing, even claiming he received messages written in dust on his helmet. These stories were dismissed as stress reactions. War plays tricks on the mind, but the whispers that followed his memorial seemed to suggest otherwise. By 2017, the whispers weren't just noticed by staff. Visitors began commenting on them online. One Reddit post, since removed, mentioned a woman who claimed she bent down to smell the wreath, only to hear her father's voice call her by her childhood nickname. The problem? Her father had been dead for years, and the voice didn't come from around her. It came from inside the wreath itself. In 2019, a paranormal investigation team quietly visited the site. They used a high-gain parabolic microphone to record the wreath overnight on May 29th. According to their logs, between 12:03 and 12:05 a.m., the microphone captured over 50 different voices, layered on top of each other in a stream of unintelligible whispering. One investigator claimed the voices weren't just random, they were memories. Trapped, playing back like echoes caught in a loop. When asked to share the audio online, the team refused. One member simply said, "You don't want to hear it. It knows your name before you do." The most chilling incident happened in 2021, when a local college student named Aaron Stevens visited the memorial as part of a photography assignment. He arrived just before midnight, hoping to capture time-lapse footage of the mysterious wreath appearing. He never saw anyone, but when he reviewed the footage later, frame by frame, he noticed something chilling. At exactly 12 a.m., the camera glitches just for a second. When it recovers, the wreath is already there. But Aaron said the real horror came when he slowed the glitch down. In one frame, just a sliver of a second, there's the faint outline of a figure in military dress, bent over, placing the wreath. His face is gaunt, hollow-eyed, and across his chest is a torn name tag. Marston. That footage was never released to the public. Not because Aaron didn't want to, but because 2 days after reviewing it, he was hospitalized for a complete nervous breakdown. He claimed he couldn't sleep because every time he closed his eyes, he heard hundreds of voices speaking at once. Not in chaos, but in sequence. One after another, repeating stories, telling secrets, sharing regrets. He said they all began the same way. It started with a wreath. Psychologists diagnosed Aaron with a rare form of auditory hallucination triggered by stress. But his closest friends said something else. They said Aaron was never stressed. He was calm, too calm, almost like he was waiting for something to finish speaking. That year, the cemetery staff decided to monitor the site live on Memorial Day. Not with cameras, but with people. 2 guards and 1 cemetery manager sat in their car, facing Marston's grave with binoculars, ready to document the delivery. Nothing happened. No one approached. No figure appeared. But at midnight, right on time, one of the guards looked away for just a second, and the wreath was there, perfectly centered, glistening with dew. The manager leaned out of the car window to call in, but paused. He later said he heard something. Not a voice, not a whisper, a sigh, as if someone had just completed something difficult, something necessary, and was ready to rest again. No one ever takes the wreath away. By morning, it's always gone. Never thrown out, never moved, never fading. It simply disappears. And yet, if you visit on the morning of May 30th and kneel close to the headstone, you might hear a murmur rise from the soil. A sound not quite wind, not quite voice, but somewhere in between. Some say it's the memory of a man who didn't want to be forgotten. Others believe it's a collection of stories tied to the living. Memories that refuse to fade until they've been passed on, like the final page of a letter waiting to be read. But one thing is certain: the wreath will return, and it will whisper again. It was Memorial Day when Jacob Langley, a retired park ranger and amateur war historian, decided to visit Fort Thorne Cemetery, a remote, largely forgotten military burial ground nestled deep in the pine-covered hills of northern Pennsylvania. The graveyard was reserved for soldiers who died in the 1800s, many of whom were never claimed by family. There were no glossy headstones or polished plaques, just moss-covered markers and rusted iron fences that creaked when the wind stirred. Jacob wasn't there to mourn anyone he knew. His visits were more of a tradition, a way of paying respect to those long forgotten. He brought an old brass bugle, one he'd found in an antique shop decades ago, and played taps every year at exactly 7 p.m., sunset. It was quiet, solemn, and usually uneventful. But that year, something changed. As he raised the bugle to his lips and played the mournful melody, a gust of wind swept through the trees with such force that it bent the tall grass flat. Jacob paused, confused, as the last note echoed through the hollow. The cemetery felt colder than usual, the air dense. He brushed it off. Old age, maybe, or nerves. Still, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching him. He turned to leave, but froze. At the far end of the cemetery, a figure stood, tall, perfectly still, dressed in a tattered Civil War uniform. Jacob squinted. The man wasn't part of any reenactment group. He'd have known. There was no event scheduled, no visitors for miles. And yet, there he was, motionless, watching. Jacob called out. No answer. The man raised his right hand to his brow and gave a slow, deliberate salute. Jacob instinctively returned it, then looked away for just a second to adjust his glasses. When he looked back, the figure was gone. Most would have left. But Jacob, ever the curious mind, decided to walk toward the back row of graves where the man had stood. The grass here was higher, the names barely legible. One stone caught his eye. It read, David A. Illimersiv, 3rd Infantry Regiment, died 1864. The last to fall, the first to answer. He'd never noticed that epitaph before. It seemed oddly poetic, too specific. Jacob jotted the name down and left, telling himself he'd research the name later. That night, strange things began happening. Jacob awoke at 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps outside his cabin. Not the heavy thud of boots, but precise, rhythmic steps, as if someone was marching in formation. He peered out his window. No one was there, yet the sound continued for nearly 10 minutes before stopping abruptly. When he stepped outside the next morning, there were boot prints in the mud, military issue, 19th century design. The saws were narrow, heel heavy, worn down. They led from the tree line to his front porch and then disappeared. Jacob became obsessed. He returned to the cemetery the next day and the day after that. Each time he found something new. A fresh red poppy on Private Mercer's grave. A half-smoked, antique cigar placed carefully atop the headstone. Even a single brass button, tarnished with age, from a Union uniform. No one else had access to that land. Then came the dreams. Jacob began seeing flashes of trench warfare in his sleep. Those Civil War battles had no trenches like those he dreamt of. He saw Mercer crawling through mud, lifting fallen comrades, dodging cannon fire, clutching a torn bugle to his chest. The dreams felt less like imagination and more like memories, but they weren't his. One night, he awoke to the sound of a bugle being played. Taps, again, but this time not by him. It was coming from the woods, echoing through the trees with haunting clarity. Jacob followed the sound, flashlight shaking in his hand. At the cemetery, there was no one. Only the wind and that same grave. But something was different. The bugle he'd always brought with him, the antique one he kept safely locked in a display case, was sitting atop Private Mercer's grave, covered in fresh dirt. Jacob hadn't brought it. He hadn't touched it in weeks. Disturbed, he picked it up. It was cold, too cold. As he did, he noticed something even more chilling. The grave had changed. The inscription was no longer weathered. The letters were freshly carved, the stone unmarred. Divite illimerse. He was called, and he returned. Jacob staggered back, dropping the bugle. When he tried to leave, his flashlight flickered, then died. In total darkness, he heard footsteps again. Closer this time. Slower, as if someone was walking up behind him. He turned, but there was only fog. He ran home, locked the doors, didn't sleep. Weeks passed, but the story didn't end. Neighbors began to report seeing a man in uniform wandering the tree lines. Always silent, always watching. The local librarian found books mysteriously refiled to Civil War sections. A visitor even claimed to hear the sound of a bugle echoing through the hills at sunset, always at 7 p.m. Jacob eventually stopped going to the cemetery. But one day, he received a package. No return address. Inside was a black and white photo, aged and cracked. It showed a Union soldier standing beside a man who looked exactly like Jacob. Same face, same eyes. But the photograph was dated 1865 and scrawled on the back in delicate cursive. "Thank you for answering the call, Jacob. Yem." He never played the bugle again. But every Memorial Day at 7 p.m., without fail, the sound of taps still drifts through the Pennsylvania hills. Played not by the living, but by the one who was last to fall and first to answer. It started with a school field trip. Nina wasn't supposed to be there that day. She'd been sick all week. But the teacher convinced her parents to let her attend. The local war memorial had just been restored after a fire, and the school wanted every senior to witness the unveiling. It was meant to be educational, honoring the fallen, they said, a moment to reflect on history. But Nina couldn't shake the headache that had throbbed behind her eyes since she stepped off the bus. The memorial was carved into black stone, long and curved like a crescent moon. It stretched across the park, glistening under the sun. Hundreds of names etched in crisp serif letters. Names of those who had died in wars, disasters, and mysterious local tragedies over the last century. Some were from recent decades. Others were nearly erased by time. As her classmates wandered off to take pictures and fill out worksheets, Nina walked along the stone wall, tracing the names with her eyes. Most meant nothing to her. Just names. Just history. Until she saw her own. Not someone with the same last name. Not a distant relative. Her exact name. Nina Elin Rowe. It was carved about a third of the way down the wall. The same spelling, same middle name, same everything. She stopped breathing for a second. The world dimmed around her. It wasn't a common name. Her parents had even joked that she was Google unique. Yet here it was, carved in polished stone. At first, she thought it had to be a mistake. A typo maybe, but the date of death next to it chilled her, October 19th. This year, that was a week from today. Nina stumbled back from the wall, her thoughts racing. Someone was messing with her. It had to be a prank. But the lettering matched the others perfectly, weathered deep, cleanly chiseled. It wasn't fresh. It wasn't fake. She didn't tell anyone. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her name reflecting in the black stone. She started searching online. News archive, old obituaries. Nothing. No Nina Elin Rowe had ever died in this town, let alone been memorialized for it. She finally broke and told her parents the next day. They laughed it off. Coincidence, her dad said. Just someone who happened to have your name. It doesn't mean anything. But Nina kept checking. Every day, the name didn't disappear. It was always there, waiting. Then things started happening. The first was a phone call, a number with no ID. When she picked up, there was nothing but static, then a faint voice whispering her name. Not once. Repeated. Over and over. She hung up, heart pounding. Her mom told her it was probably spam. Then the dreams began. In one, she was standing in front of the memorial again. Alone. It was darker this time, the walls slick with rain. One by one, the names began to vanish, erased as if by invisible hands, until only one was left. Hers. She would wake up in a sweat every time. As the date on the wall crept closer, Nina stopped going to school. Her parents thought she was overreacting. Even her best friend, May, seemed unsure of what to say. But on the night of October 18th, May agreed to go with her back to the memorial. To prove it's all in your head, she said. We'll check the name together. You'll feel better. They waited until after dark. The park was silent except for the wind. The trees barely moved. The lights along the path flickered more than usual. It started with a school field trip. Nina wasn't supposed to be there that day. She'd been sick all week. But the teacher convinced her parents to let her attend. The local war memorial had just been restored after a fire, and the school wanted every senior to witness the unveiling. It was meant to be educational, honoring the fallen, they said, a moment to reflect on history. But Nina couldn't shake the headache that had throbbed behind her eyes since she stepped off the bus. The memorial was carved into black stone, long and curved like a crescent moon. It stretched across the park, glistening under the sun. Hundreds of names etched in crisp serif letters. Names of those who had died in wars, disasters, and mysterious local tragedies over the last century. Some were from recent decades. Others were nearly erased by time. As her classmates wandered off to take pictures and fill out worksheets, Nina walked along the stone wall, tracing the names with her eyes. Most meant nothing to her. Just names. Just history. Until she saw her own. Not someone with the same last name. Not a distant relative. Her exact name. Nina Elin Rowe. It was carved about a third of the way down the wall. The same spelling. Same middle name. Same everything. She stopped breathing for a second. The world dimmed around her. It wasn't a common name. Her parents had even joked that she was Google unique. Yet here it was, carved in polished stone. At first, she thought it had to be a mistake. A typo maybe, but the date of death next to it chilled her, October 19th. This year, that was a week from today. Nina stumbled back from the wall, her thoughts racing. Someone was messing with her. It had to be a prank. But the lettering matched the others perfectly, weathered deep, cleanly chiseled. It wasn't fresh. It wasn't fake. She didn't tell anyone. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her name reflecting in the black stone. She started searching online. News archive, old obituaries. Nothing. No Nina Elin Rowe had ever died in this town, let alone been memorialized for it. She finally broke and told her parents the next day. They laughed it off. Coincidence, her dad said. Just someone who happened to have your name. It doesn't mean anything. But Nina kept checking. Every day, the name didn't disappear. It was always there, waiting. Then things started happening. The first was a phone call, a number with no ID. When she picked up, there was nothing but static, then a faint voice whispering her name. Not once. Repeated, over and over. She hung up, heart pounding. Her mom told her it was probably spam. Then the dreams began. In one, she was standing in front of the memorial again. Alone. It was darker this time, the walls slick with rain. One by one, the names began to vanish, erased as if by invisible hands, until only one was left. Hers. She would wake up in a sweat every time. As the date on the wall crept closer, Nina stopped going to school. Her parents thought she was overreacting. Even her best friend, May, seemed unsure of what to say. But on the night of October 18th, May agreed to go with her back to the memorial. To prove it's all in your head, she said. We'll check the name together. You'll feel better. They waited until after dark. The park was silent except for the wind. The trees barely moved. The lights along the path flickered more than usual. It began quietly, as many true horror stories do, with grief and a man trying to make sense of loss. In the town of Grantsfield, surrounded by fog-laced hills and long-forgotten roads, a man named Mark returned after 10 years of silence. He had left town right after his younger brother, Danny, died in a hunting accident. Mark hadn't attended the funeral. He hadn't answered calls, and when their parents passed later, he never showed up. The locals believed Mark had unraveled from the trauma. But one cold April morning, he came back. No one recognized him at first. He was gaunt, almost spectral, like a man too long away from light. His eyes looked hollow, not from sadness, but from something deeper, something calcified inside. He didn't speak much, just asked one question over and over again. Where did they bury Danny? At first, people assumed he wanted closure. Maybe he was trying to make amends with his past. But what followed quickly shattered that hope. A week after his arrival, groundskeepers at the Grantsfield Memorial Cemetery found something unsettling. Danny's grave, stone cracked, soil disturbed, fresh drag marks in the earth, had been dug up. Not by vandals, but by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The work was precise, methodical, practiced. The coffin was missing. Police launched an investigation. Townsfolk whispered about devil worship or some form of rural madness. But security footage from a nearby funeral home gave the first real clue. Mark was seen walking into the cemetery at midnight, shovel in hand. Calm, unafraid, focused. He wore no gloves. He didn't cover his face. He walked like a man doing something inevitable. But what chilled investigators was what came next. The footage showed him digging for hours, without rest, without even looking around once. Then, at precisely 3:09 a.m., he stood perfectly still over the open grave and whispered something into it. A long sentence, unintelligible, like a chant or apology. After a moment, he stepped into the hole and vanished from view. He never climbed out. The footage ended with nothing else. No sounds, no figures, just the swaying trees and static. When authorities arrived that morning, the coffin was gone, but the grave was empty. No sign of Mark, no trace of his tools, no blood, no footprints leading out. It was as though he had sunk into the earth. Forensics teams found nothing below, only a void of disturbed soil that abruptly stopped, like the hole had caved in from beneath. The coffin wasn't buried deeper. There were no tunnels, just an eerie silence and a temperature drop that made several workers leave early, sick to their stomachs. Over the next few weeks, people reported strange sightings near the cemetery. Children claimed they saw a man kneeling by Danny's grave at night, sobbing into the dirt. Others heard tapping sounds from under the stone slab. One widow swore she saw 2 sets of handprints pressed into the inside of her fogged-up car windows when she parked by the cemetery gates. The cemetery staff tried to reseal the grave and replace the stone, but every attempt failed. The new stones would crack overnight. Flowers wilted within minutes. Even grass refused to grow there. The plot remained barren, like the land itself rejected anything but the original grave. People started avoiding the area. But here's where the story gets darker. A journal was found, marks, discovered in a dilapidated motel room just outside town. Inside were pages of disturbing notes. He wrote of dreams, repeating, vivid. In them, Danny wasn't dead but trapped, not metaphorically, literally buried alive in a space between, calling out through soil that didn't exist in our world. Mark claimed Danny was reaching up, not to escape, but to pull him down, as though death was just the beginning of a reunion neither of them had chosen. The final entry read, "He's not angry. He's lonely, and I owe him that silence. I owe him the dirt." After that, no one saw Mark again. He was never found, not by family, not by police, not even in death. Some say he's still down there, in that thin place between Earth and something else. Some believe he was never really human again when he returned to Grantsfield. That whatever answered his question that first night wasn't his brother. Because sometimes it's not about finding peace with the dead. Sometimes the dead are just looking for someone to keep them company. They called it Angel's Rest, a modest cemetery tucked into a forgotten grove on the edge of an old southern town, where rust-covered gates stood barely upright and gravel paths wound between rows of weather-worn headstones. It was quiet, too quiet. Most people passed it without a second glance, except for one feature that always drew the eye: a small marble statue of a child kneeling in prayer, placed at the very center. No one remembered who put it there. The stone bore no name, no date, no inscription, just the image of a child with folded hands and a sorrowful expression. Locals had theories, of course. Some said it was a memorial to victims of a long-forgotten fire. Others whispered it was a warning, a seal to hold something beneath the earth. What unnerved everyone, though, was what happened at dusk. Visitors, at least the rare ones brave or foolish enough to be there as the sun fell, reported hearing it. A sound soft as mist, choked sobbing, the sound of a child crying beneath the statue. Every evening, as light drained from the sky, the weeping would begin. Quiet, pitiful, and unmistakably human. Some dismissed it as wind slipping through the trees. Others suggested mourning doves. But those who stood too close, they said otherwise. In 2016, a teenager named Owen took it as a dare. He was the kind of kid who liked to push limits. And when the legend resurfaced on a local subreddit, he saw it as an opportunity to prove how fake it all was. He brought a flashlight, a Bluetooth speaker to blast music, and a GoPro strapped to his chest. Going ghost hunting at Angel's Rest, he joked in his last Instagram story. He went in around 6:45 p.m. At 7:05, he posted a selfie beside the statue, smiling, confident, then nothing. By 9 p.m., his parents filed a missing person report. They found his phone outside the cemetery gates the next morning. His flashlight lay shattered by the statue. The GoPro footage was intact, but corrupted beyond recovery, except for 3 seconds, a blurry, low-resolution frame showing the statue's head slightly turned toward him. It was impossible, of course. Just pareidolia. But Owen was never found. And the crying? Louder than ever since that night. Years passed. People moved away. The statue aged. Rain darkened its face, and moss crept up its base, making the features harder to distinguish. But the weeping remained. In 2021, a historian named Evelyn took interest in the site. She wasn't chasing ghosts. She was researching burial grounds that lacked official records. Angel's Rest was one of the only ones in the county with dozens of graves and no maintained registry. She wanted to know who was buried there and why so many plots lacked names. While combing through courthouse archives, she found something strange. The land had once belonged to the Whitmore Orphanage, a now-demolished estate that operated until the early 1900s. Fires, illness, and neglect had claimed dozens of lives there, mostly children. The only official memorial was erected decades later, and the only marker ever placed was that child statue. She dug deeper. There was no public outcry, no mass funeral, no acknowledgement in newspapers, save for a single clipped line in an 1894 local journal. One cries still, though the others sleep. When Evelyn visited the site herself, she brought soil sampling equipment and a small ground-penetrating radar unit. Her intention was to map unmarked graves. What she found startled her: a hollow cavity beneath the statue, man-made, rectangular, and bricked over. A burial vault, likely forgotten for over a century. But when she reported it to the county, no action was taken. No one wanted to disturb it. Let the past rest, they told her. Still, Evelyn couldn't let it go. She began having dreams. A child's voice calling her name. Whispers in the voice of a girl who sounded so lonely. She returned at dusk one final time, months later. Her journal notes recovered afterward tell of a strange cold around the statue, a pressure behind her eyes, and a voice, not heard, but felt, saying, "They locked me here. Please listen." Then the crying began. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was directly beneath her feet. She ran. Her last entry ended with a line she scribbled hastily. She's not weeping anymore. She's awake. Evelyn disappeared 2 days later. Her car was found abandoned at the edge of the woods near Angel's Rest. Doors unlocked. Engine cold. No sign of struggle. Just her field notebook in the passenger seat, open to a page with a childlike drawing of the statue. Except this version had eyes. Deep, sunken, hollow. And they were open. Since then, locals have reported strange behavior in the area. GPS malfunctions. Phone batteries draining instantly. Shadows moving just beyond torchlight. Most chilling of all, the reports that the statue doesn't always stay in the same position. Some claim they've seen it standing. Others say its hands are no longer folded. A few even swear it's watching the road now, as if waiting for someone. But the weeping continues, always at dusk, and though many theories try to explain it, acoustics, animals, atmospheric pressure, those who've truly heard it say there's something in that cry that defies logic. It's grief soaked in something deeper, something ancient, a mourning not for what was lost, but for what still waits to be found. So if you ever visit Angel's Rest, leave before the sun touches the trees. Don't speak, don't linger, and whatever you do, never kneel near the statue. You may hear her, and worse, she may hear you. I never expected to find anything unusual at my mother's grave. She died quietly in a hospital bed, a lonely woman who had outlived everyone she loved. No enemies, no mysterious past, just the slow erosion of time and memory. We held a small service, just me and a couple of co-workers from the retirement home who felt obligated to come. There was no one else. For the first few weeks, I visited the grave every Sunday. Grief has a rhythm, and I clung to it like a ritual. The grave was always undisturbed. Just a simple plaque, a little weathered already, and the fading white lilies I brought each week. But one morning, 6 Sundays after the funeral, I found something different. A single red rose, fresh, upright, placed exactly at the foot of the headstone. It was strange, but not sinister. At first, I assumed it was a kind gesture from a cemetery worker, or maybe a mistake. There was a burial not far from hers recently, and I wondered if someone had left it at the wrong site. The next Sunday, there were 2 roses, still fresh, still perfect. Again, I brushed it off. Coincidence, perhaps, or someone else grieving who found solace in sharing. But the 3rd week, when I found 3 roses neatly arranged in a glass jar beside my own flowers, I began to feel it, that tremor in the air, that sense you're not alone, even when you are. I asked the groundskeeper. He said he hadn't seen anyone visiting her plot. In fact, he thought she didn't have any family left. She was mostly a Jane Doe, he said. People like that, they fade. I didn't correct him, but someone hadn't forgotten her. Someone remembered her enough to return every week, perfectly on time, with a growing bouquet of blood-red roses. By the 8th week, the grave was choked with them. 8 perfect stems, not a single petal wilted. It was summer, but the ground around the grave was strangely soft. I knelt down to rearrange the flowers and felt something off. The soil was warm, not just sun-warmed. It radiated heat from underneath, as though something deeper was stirring. I pulled my hand back and told myself I was imagining things. I left earlier than usual, but curiosity has a way of festering. I returned midweek, around 11 p.m. I parked outside the cemetery gates and walked the 1/4 mile to the grave. I don't know what I expected. Maybe some heartbroken figure kneeling in the dark. Some old flame. A forgotten friend. But I saw no one, until I noticed the smoke. Thin, wispy tendrils of white were rising from the grass around her plot. Not smoke from fire, but something colder, like breath in the dead of winter. And in the center of it stood a figure. Back turned, pale suit, holding the 9th rose. He didn't place it down. He just stood there, unmoving, as if the flower itself was anchoring him to this world. I should have called out. I should have spoken. But then he turned, and there was no face. Not disfigured, not shadowed, just smooth, featureless skin like polished porcelain. No eyes, no mouth, just a faint impression where a face should be, like a memory half formed. I blinked, and he was gone. The rose was placed. The air was warm again. The grave was humming. I ran. In the days that followed, I tried to research her past. I even pulled records from her youth, anything I could find, and I discovered something I never knew. Before I was born, my mother had a son, a stillborn child. No father on record, just a tiny obituary in a forgotten town. The name simply read, infant male, survived by mother C. Dunlow. She never spoke of him, not once. On the 10th Sunday, I returned again. 10 roses, a perfect circle, and in the center, a name etched into the stone that wasn't there before. Nathaniel. The letters were carved deep, not engraved by any tool I knew. They looked burned in, like the heat I'd felt that day had seared them through the marble itself. I didn't sleep that night. On the 11th visit, I brought a shovel. I told myself I wouldn't use it, but something in me, some deep ancestral warning, told me I had to know. I dug. The soil crumbled too easily. No resistance. No roots. Just a void. And then I hit wood. But it wasn't the casket from her burial. That one was deeper. This was new. Smaller. A child box. I couldn't bring myself to open it. I just stood there, the air around me humming, the roses blooming wider as if feeding off the moment. Then I heard it. A knock. From inside the box. 3 slow knocks. Then silence. I covered it back up. On the 12th Sunday, I stayed home. I couldn't face it, but someone left 12 roses anyway, delivered to my front door, arranged in a perfect spiral, tied with black thread. No card. I moved the next day, but it didn't stop. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, a single rose appears. First at my doorstep, then on my windowsill. This year, it was already in my bedroom when I woke up. 13 years since her passing. 13 roses. And this morning, I found something new. A note tucked beneath the petals. In a child's scrawl, it read, "You forgot my name again." It was supposed to be a peaceful memorial, simple, somber, and final. When the Richards family held a burial service for their eldest son, Paul, it was symbolic more than anything else. His body was never recovered after the fire at the Hillpine Research Facility, a remote government compound deep in Northern Oregon. But they needed closure, so a casket was filled with mementos, sealed, and buried in the family plot. It was in every way empty, except that wasn't quite true. It began the following week. The groundskeeper, Harold, noticed the sod above Paul's grave had begun to shift. At first, he chalked it up to settling earth, normal for a new plot. But then came the hollow's slight impressions, not footprints exactly, but distortions in the grass as if someone or something was pacing back and forth just beneath the surface. When Harold reported this, the cemetery manager dismissed it, reminding him the casket was empty. No body, no movement. Simple. Harold didn't press the issue, but he started keeping notes. On the 9th night, Harold watched from the chapel window. Under a waxing moon, he saw the soil above Paul's grave rise, stretch, and fall, like something inside was breathing. He quit the next morning. Paul Richards had been a materials chemist. According to sparse and redacted reports, the fire at Hillpine was no ordinary accident. Multiple witnesses described a hum moments before the blast, low frequency, gut churning, like a throat clearing just beneath the skin of the world. The site was locked down. No bodies were recovered. Just ash, melted steel, and a single pair of glasses, Paul's. But strange things began to follow those who had attended the burial. Paul's younger sister, Dana, came home one night to find her cat clawing furiously at the basement door. When she opened it, she found a smear of ash across the concrete floor and a single, wet footprint. The smell of scorched copper lingered for hours. His father, Mark, became withdrawn, speaking less and less each day. He was later found in Paul's old room, staring at the wall with a look of exhausted terror, repeating the phrase, "He's trying to come back wrong." Neighbors began avoiding the cemetery altogether. There were stories someone heard whispering from beneath the soil. Another claimed to see heat waves rising from the ground, even in the rain. But perhaps the most disturbing account came from a local teenager named Benji. He had dared himself to lie on Paul's grave overnight as part of a social media challenge. His friends left him there, planning to return at dawn. They never made it. Benji came running out of the cemetery at 3:12 a.m., screaming, his skin covered in burns, though the weather had been freezing. All he could say was, the casket wasn't empty. In the months that followed, strange electromagnetic fluctuations began to manifest within a 10-foot radius of the grave. Phones died instantly. Compasses spun. Wildlife avoided the plot entirely. It became a dead zone, literally and technologically. And then, on the anniversary of the burial, a deep crack appeared in the headstone. Not chipped, not eroded, cracked clean through as though split from the inside. One paranormal investigator, Amanda Gills, managed to get audio from the site. Most of it was ambient noise. But at exactly 2:47 a.m., a low thrum was picked up by the recorder. Not wind, not animals. A mechanical, rhythmic vibration, similar to a slowed-down heartbeat. She isolated it, cleaned the distortion, and what emerged was a horrifying revelation. The sound wasn't ambient at all. It was speech, layered and slow. A single sentence repeated 6 times in a voice no human could produce. They buried me empty. I feel myself. Amanda never published the findings. She vanished 6 days later. Her apartment was left undisturbed, except for her laptop, which had melted into the desk. The grave has since been sealed with reinforced concrete. A steel cage has been bolted over it at the family's request. But it hasn't stopped the movement. Night security footage shows the bars flexing just slightly between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. each morning. No one knows what's inside. Not for sure. Some believe Paul Richards never died. Others think something used his name to cross over, wearing the identity like a mask stitched from memory and matter. But the truth might be worse. Something found the empty space and decided to make it its own. To inhabit the symbolic, to wear the hollow. And every year on the anniversary, the soil breathes a little deeper, as if whatever's inside is growing, waiting, not to be found, but to be remembered. The park at the edge of town was always quiet, especially at night. It was the kind of place where the sounds of the world seemed to fade away. The benches lined the paths, weathered and old, each one bearing a name, a date, a dedication. The park had been built in memory of those who'd lived and died, and yet no one really came here anymore. Not after dark. It was the perfect place to reflect, to feel the weight of time pressing down on you. And for Joseph, it had become a ritual, his nightly walk. He had always found solace in the solitude of the park, the comfort of shadows that seemed to hold his thoughts in quiet reverence. But there was one bench in particular that had drawn his attention for weeks now. It sat alone under a large oak tree, its wooden slats rough and worn, like it had been here longer than the others. The plaque on the back was simple, just a name and a date. Harper, 1942 to 1992. Joseph had no reason to know who Harper was, but something about the bench and the plaque felt wrong. It was as if the wood had absorbed something, a strange energy that lingered in the air around it, particularly late at night. He often found himself walking by, glancing at the bench, and feeling a chill he couldn't quite explain. It started with small things, whispers when the wind was still, fleeting shadows just out of the corner of his eye. He chalked it up to his imagination, the result of too many late nights and too little sleep. But then, one evening, things changed. He had been walking through the park later than usual that night, the moon barely visible through a clouded sky. His footsteps echoed on the gravel, a soft rhythm against the silence. As he approached the oak tree, he saw the bench in the distance, bathed in a pale light from the street lamp. But something was different. It seemed to glow faintly, as if the bench itself was alive. Joseph stopped dead in his tracks, heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick like a storm was rolling in, but the sky remained still. He glanced around, but the park was empty. He wasn't sure why he felt so compelled to approach, but his feet moved of their own accord. As he neared the bench, he noticed a figure sitting on it, a shadow against the wood. It was a woman, her face hidden in the folds of her coat. She didn't seem to acknowledge his presence, and her stillness was unnerving. He was about to turn away when a sudden gust of wind knocked the branches above him, causing the leaves to rustle in a dissonant chorus. But it was what he heard next that froze him. A scream, a sharp, agonizing scream that tore through the silence of the park. It came from a bench. Joseph's heart stopped. The woman didn't move. She remained hunched over, unmoving, as the scream continued, reverberating in the air. The sound was guttural, like something deep within the earth itself, as though it had been buried for years, clawing its way to the surface. His legs refused to move. The scream twisted and distorted, rising and falling, but never fading. He glanced at the bench again, but the woman was still there, silent. The scream seemed to come from everywhere, around him, beneath him, echoing through his bones. Suddenly, he heard again, but this time it wasn't from the bench. It came from behind him, from the shadows by the trees. Joseph spun around, but there was no one there. The park was empty, yet the scream persisted. It was relentless, like it was part of the very fabric of the park itself, an eternal torment bound to the land. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scream stopped. The park fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Joseph's shallow breathing. His heart was racing, and he could feel the cold sweat on his skin. He slowly backed away from the bench, not daring to look back at it, but the image of the woman sitting there, motionless, stayed with him. He didn't return to the park that night, or the next, or the one after that. Days turned into weeks, and Joseph tried to push the incident out of his mind, but it lingered, gnawing at him. He couldn't stop thinking about the bench, about the scream, about the woman who had been there, yet hadn't moved. He told himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. One night, unable to shake the feeling, he found himself back at the park, standing at the edge of the path. The bench stood ahead, bathed in moonlight, as if waiting for him. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to leave, but something kept him rooted to the spot. He took a step forward, then another, until he stood before the bench once again. The plaque still read M. Harper, 1942 to 1992. The bench seemed the same, old and weathered, but something felt different. The air around it was thick, heavier than before. He couldn't explain why, but he reached for the bench, his fingers brushing the wood. The moment he made contact, the scream returned. This time, it wasn't a distant echo. It was inside his head, ringing so loudly that he thought his skull might crack under the pressure. The sound was maddening, each note sending a shock wave through his body. Joseph tried to pull his hand away, but it was as if the bench had a hold on him. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw flashes of something. Visions of people, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in screams that matched the one he heard. It was as if they were trapped in the bench, their souls bound to the wood. The scream reached a fever pitch, then abruptly stopped. Joseph stumbled back, his legs trembling beneath him. He looked at the bench, but there was no woman this time. Only the quiet, still park, as if nothing had happened. But he knew better. The scream was always there, waiting, buried deep beneath the surface, ready to tear through the silence again. And Joseph knew that no matter how far he walked, no matter how many years passed, the bench would always be there, calling to him. The scream would never stop. It started like any other weekend. My friends and I were always looking for something new to explore, something off the beaten path. But there was something about this trip that felt different, like we were about to uncover a secret that should have remained buried. We had heard rumors about an old war monument, hidden deep in the woods near the outskirts of town. It wasn't on any map, and the few who spoke of it did so in hushed voices, as if even mentioning it invited bad luck. Despite the warnings, my friend Adam, who was always the one to push us toward the unexplained, insisted we check it out. "Come on, it'll be an adventure," Adam said, grinning as he grabbed his camera. "Think of the footage I'll get. This could be something huge. The forgotten history, the untouched memorial, it's perfect." The drive there was quiet. The usual banter had faded, replaced by the growing tension of entering a place no one really seemed to want us to visit. The further we went, the more the world seemed to grow still. The trees crowded the road, casting long, shadowy fingers over our car. When we arrived, the place was more unsettling than I'd expected. The monument itself was a crumbling stone structure, surrounded by thick underbrush and towering trees. It stood alone, like a forgotten sentinel, watching over the land. The plaque was barely legible, its details eroded by time. All we could make out was a series of names, most faded beyond recognition, and a date, 1917. Adam immediately set to work, setting up his camera. He had this obsession with capturing the strange and unusual. "I'll film the whole thing. You guys stand by and watch," he said, his voice filled with excitement. I wasn't as eager. Something about the monument felt off. It wasn't just the eerie stillness of the place, but the way it seemed to pull at the air, like there was something unseen lingering around us. As Adam moved closer to the stone, adjusting his camera for the perfect shot, I noticed something strange, a low hum in the air. It was so faint that at first I thought it was just the wind. But then, as Adam began speaking into the camera, something else happened. The camera flickered. A soft, almost imperceptible buzzing sound filled the air. At first, I thought it was a technical issue. But then Adam stopped mid-sentence. He looked up, his expression changing from one of curiosity to something far darker. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, as though he didn't want the camera to pick it up. I strained my ears, but all I heard was the wind and the distant rustling of leaves. "What are you talking about?" I asked, but Adam wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on something beyond us, something just out of sight. I followed his gaze, but all I could see were the trees, the dense forest stretching out in all directions. There was nothing there. A sudden chill ran down my spine. "Adam?" I called out. "What's going on?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a few steps forward towards the monument. His camera was still recording, but the lens was now pointed at the ground. Then, without warning, he began to walk around the stone, muttering to himself under his breath. "I can hear them," he murmured, almost delirious. "They're here, they never left." The words didn't make sense. "Adam, come back," I shouted, but he didn't respond. I hurried toward him, but just as I reached out to grab his shoulder, something strange happened. The air around us grew thick, and a sudden pressure weighed down on my chest, as though I was being crushed by invisible hands. I gasped for breath, stumbling back. My vision blurred, and for a brief moment, everything around me spun wildly. When I regained my bearings, Adam was gone. The place around me had gone silent. The hum, the buzzing, everything was still, but Adam had vanished. "Adam!" I called out, panic setting in. My voice echoed in the empty woods, but there was no response. The camera was still on the ground, facing upward, but Adam was nowhere to be found. I spent the next few hours searching the area, calling his name, but it was as if the woods themselves were swallowing him whole. Every time I thought I saw movement between the trees, I would rush toward it, only to find nothing. No sign of Adam, no footprints, no trace of where he had gone. When I finally made my way back to the monument, I found something that sent chills down my spine, a small, handwritten note tucked into the crevice of the stone. The writing was shaky, as though written in haste. It read, "They can't leave. They never leave." The words seemed to pulse with a strange energy. Something about them felt wrong, like a warning. I left the woods, but Adam never returned. Weeks passed, and I tried everything to find him. I called the authorities. I contacted anyone who might have known about the area, but no one had seen him. No one had heard anything. It was as if he had disappeared from existence. And each time I revisited the spot, the air grew heavier, more oppressive. Then, one night, I watched the footage he had filmed at the monument. The video was grainy, filled with static, but there was one part that chilled me to my core. As Adam panned the camera over the monument, there was something that wasn't there before. In the reflection of the stone, I saw a figure standing just behind him, too faint to make out clearly, but unmistakable in its presence. The figure was tall, thin, and shrouded in shadow, almost like a wisp of smoke. But as the camera zoomed in, the shadow seemed to move, step forward, and then nothing. The screen went black. I never found out what happened to Adam that day. But every time I hear the faintest hum in the distance, I wonder if he's still out there, somewhere caught between this world and the next, trapped by the monument, forever part of its forgotten history. It was an overcast afternoon when Andrew decided to visit the old cemetery on the edge of town. He'd heard rumors about the place, ghostly whispers carried in the wind, sightings of a woman in white who appeared at dusk, walking among the tombstones as though searching for something. He'd never believed in such stories, dismissing them as nothing more than superstition or the overactive imaginations of thrill seekers. But there was something about this cemetery that had always drawn him in. The ancient, weathered stones, some cracked and leaning, others barely legible. This was a place untouched by time, a place where the living rarely tread. As he stepped through the rusted iron gates, the world outside seemed to fall away. The hum of the city, the noise of traffic, it all faded as he walked deeper into the cemetery. There was something peaceful about the silence here, the stillness that settled over everything. It was almost as if the dead had claimed this space for themselves, and the living were merely trespassers, unwelcome, out of place. Andrew walked slowly, reading the names on the tombstones as he passed. Most of them were too old to make out, the letters worn and faded by time. But a few were still legible, names that sent shivers down his spine. Long-forgotten souls who had once walked the streets of the town, now reduced to mere whispers in the wind. He didn't know why, but something made him stop by an old stone bench, half covered by ivy. As he sat down, he gazed around the cemetery, his thoughts drifting. That's when he saw her, a figure dressed all in white, moving among the headstones. She wasn't walking, not exactly. It was as if she were gliding, her feet barely touching the ground. Her long, flowing gown shimmered in the dim light, and her hair, dark and cascading, seemed to move with a life of its own. She was walking slowly, deliberately, stopping at each headstone to touch the weathered stone with her fingertips, lingering there for a few moments before moving on. Andrew couldn't help but stare. He'd heard the stories, but seeing her with his own eyes, it was unlike anything he could have imagined. He felt a cold chill creep up his spine as he watched her move through the graveyard. Each time she touched a headstone, the air seemed to grow heavier, the atmosphere thick with something unspoken. It was as if she were searching for something or someone. Andrew's heart began to race. His mind screamed at him to leave, to turn around and walk away, but his feet were rooted to the ground. His eyes followed her, unable to tear themselves away. She moved closer, her movements almost hypnotic. And then, to Andrew's shock, she stopped right in front of him. Her cold, pale hand reached out, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The wind stopped blowing, the leaves stopped rustling. All that existed was the woman in white and the icy grip of her presence. She looked at him then. Her eyes were dark, empty pools, as if they had seen everything the world had to offer and yet nothing at all. Her gaze sent a shiver through Andrew, a deep, unsettling feeling that crawled under his skin. Her mouth parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, but no words came. Instead, she took a step forward. Andrew froze, his breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He felt the air around him grow colder, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. And then her fingers touched his arm. A jolt of cold surged through him, as if ice had poured directly into his veins. His skin felt like it was on fire, burning with an intensity he couldn't explain. He gasped, trying to pull away, but it was like his body was no longer his own. He couldn't break free from her touch, the grip so tight it felt as though it were pressing into his very soul. The world around him seemed to fade, and for a moment, Andrew was no longer in the cemetery. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold, where shadows stretched endlessly into nothingness. The woman in white was beside him, her presence suffocating, her touch searing. And in that darkness, Andrew heard a voice so quiet, so faint, it might have been a whisper carried by the wind. "Find him." The words echoed in his mind, repeating over and over until they became a mantra. He tried to speak, to ask her what she meant, but his mouth wouldn't move. It was as though his very voice had been stolen, locked away in a place he could not reach. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the grip on his arm released. The coldness faded, the dark void disappeared, and he was back in the cemetery. The woman in white was gone. Andrew stumbled backward, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around, but the cemetery was empty. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves in the trees, but it was no longer the eerie, heavy silence it had been before. Shaken, he stood there for a moment, trying to comprehend what had just happened. He glanced at the spot where the woman had been, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had never been there at all. But when he looked down at his arm, his breath caught in his throat. There, on his skin, was the faintest imprint of a hand. A cold, ghostly handprint, like frost on a window, etched into his flesh. As the sun began to set, Andrew hurriedly left the cemetery, the woman's final words echoing in his mind. Find him. Who had she been? And what was it that she wanted him to find? The cold handprint on his arm remained, a chilling reminder of the woman in white, and the mystery that he would never be able to shake. It was a small cemetery, tucked away at the edge of town, a place that few dared visit after sunset. Most of the locals avoided it, speaking in hushed tones about its strange and unnerving history. The cemetery had always been there, but it was more than just a burial ground. It was a place that grew in ways that no one could explain. The town had always known about it, though most of its residents turned their backs on the eerie graveyard. At the heart of it stood an old, weathered stone wall. No one knew when it was built or by whom. Yet, the locals had always known one thing: the wall was growing. The cemetery, once small and humble, had expanded over the years, and every time it did, something unsettling would happen. It was the 1970s when Samson Richards first noticed it. Samson was a curious man, always looking for answers to questions others were too afraid to ask. One late autumn evening, he ventured into the cemetery to see it for himself. He had heard the whispers about the dead rising, but the stories were just that, stories. Or so he thought. The wind was colder than usual that evening, biting through his coat as he made his way toward the wall. His breath misted in the air, disappearing as quickly as it came. The cemetery had grown considerably over the years, now encompassing more land than he could have imagined. Samson couldn't help but wonder how it had all started. How had the cemetery expanded beyond its original borders? Had it always been this large? And then something strange caught his eye. One of the gravestones was fresh, newly placed, but there were no signs of recent burial. The soil around the stone was still soft, as though it had only been disturbed hours before. But there was something more disturbing. The name engraved on the tombstone was not one that Samson recognized. It was the name of a man who had lived in the town nearly a decade before. But the grave hadn't existed before. Samson knelt beside it, examining the grave, his heart racing. The name seemed to shimmer in the dim light, almost as though it had been written with freshly fallen dew. He had heard of the cemetery growing, but this was something else. This was too much. He stood and walked toward the stone wall, feeling an unsettling sense of dread creep up his spine. There was an energy to this place, a pulsating force, as if the cemetery was alive, constantly expanding and consuming everything around it. The next evening, Samson returned, hoping to get more answers. But this time, something felt different. The air was heavy with anticipation, thick and oppressive. He could barely make out the gravestones, their silhouettes swallowed by the darkness. Only the dim glow of a dying streetlight from the town's edge gave him any sense of direction. As he walked deeper into the cemetery, Samson noticed something even stranger. More graves had appeared, each one seeming to materialize from the earth itself, with names he didn't recognize. There was no rhyme or reason to the order of the graves, no pattern to their placement. The ground seemed to be shifting, as though the cemetery was reshaping itself with every passing second. The most unsettling part was the whispers. Low, haunting murmurs seemed to come from the graves themselves, carried by the wind. Samson strained to hear what they were saying, but the words were indecipherable, like echoes of forgotten voices from a time long past. Suddenly, he froze. His heart thudded in his chest as he saw a figure moving between the gravestones. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in a dark coat. His face was obscured by shadows, but Samson could see his hands, pale and bony, clutching something tightly. The figure didn't speak. He just walked. No, he drifted across the cemetery, moving through the gravestones like a ghost. Samson took a step back, his pulse quickening. He wanted to run, but his feet felt heavy, like they were rooted to the ground. His eyes followed the figure as it moved toward a particular gravestone, one that had not been there just the day before. The figure stopped, placing a small bouquet of black roses at the foot of the grave. Samson's breath caught in his throat as he realized the grave wasn't just new. It was one of the names from the town's history, a man who had disappeared years ago. The figure placed the roses and slowly turned to face Samson, their eyes meeting for just a fleeting moment. A cold chill swept over Samson, a sensation like icy fingers running down his spine. The figure began to walk away, its form slowly fading into the fog, leaving behind only the scent of decay and the faintest trace of something unearthly. Samson didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and fled from the cemetery, his heart racing as if it would burst from his chest. But as he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something that had been there long before he ever stepped foot into that cursed place. Days passed, but Samson couldn't stop thinking about the cemetery. He returned to the graveyard several times, but each time, the gravestones had changed. New graves would appear, ones he had never seen before, each one carrying a name from the past. And each time, a sense of foreboding grew stronger. Soon, the cemetery became notorious. People started talking about it, and the stories began to spread like wildfire. The cemetery was not simply a resting place for the dead. It was a trap, a place that grew with each soul who visited, each soul who lingered too long. Each time someone came to pay their respects, the cemetery grew larger, its boundaries expanding with a life of their own. Some townsfolk claimed to have seen the figure, the gaunt man in the dark coat, lurking between the gravestones at night. Some even swore they heard whispers calling their names from beyond the graves, urging them to stay, to join the growing cemetery, to become part of the land it had claimed. Years passed, and the cemetery continued to expand, its boundaries stretching farther and farther, swallowing up the land around it. It was as if the dead could not rest. They had to keep growing. It was not enough to simply be buried. They had to consume. Samson never returned to the cemetery after that night. He left the town soon after, unable to shake the fear that it wasn't just a place for the dead, but a place for the living too, if they weren't careful. The cemetery that grew with each visitor, each step taken toward its haunting silence, was something beyond comprehension. And so, the stories continue, with some saying that if you stand at the edge of the cemetery at midnight and listen carefully, you can still hear the whispers of the souls who visit, calling to you, urging you to come closer, to add your name to the ever-growing list of the lost. But remember, if you decide to visit, be careful where you step. Every year, on the first day of autumn, the town of Pinewood gathered for the memorial walk. It wasn't a large event, but the locals took it seriously, walking through the cemetery and paying their respects to loved ones, their footsteps muted by the damp earth. The tradition had been upheld for decades, and it was said that the spirits of the departed watched over the procession. This year was different, though. Ryan had lived in Pinewood his entire life, and he'd always found comfort in the cemetery's stillness. But lately, something had been eating away at him, a strange feeling that refused to be ignored. For the past 3 months, he had visited the old memorial stone near the edge of the cemetery more times than he could count. It was a tall, gray monument to the town's founding families, a tribute that stretched across generations. But lately, Ryan had noticed something unusual. Every time he visited, the stone had an additional name carved into it. At first, he thought it was his imagination, the result of too many late-night thoughts about his mother's death, which had happened just a year ago. She was buried near the memorial, and Ryan found himself visiting her grave often, perhaps too often. But the names continued to appear. They were always fresh, the etchings bold and sharp, unlike the weathered stone around them. Every new name was different, and none of them belonged to anyone Ryan recognized. The first name had appeared in the summer, Helen Foster. The second, just a month later, Charlie Stevens. Then Marie Caldwell, followed by David Morris and Lucy Klein. The odd part? None of them had died. At least, not to Ryan's knowledge. Ryan hadn't told anyone, afraid they might think he was losing his mind. But it gnawed at him, each name, each new addition. His obsession deepened, and he began to visit the memorial stone at odd hours, even at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the person responsible for the mysterious carvings. One evening, when the fog rolled in thick and heavy, Ryan saw something that made his blood run cold. As he approached the monument, he saw a figure, a man, tall and cloaked in darkness, standing in front of the stone, his hand raised to it. The figure moved with strange, almost mechanical precision, as though he were placing something onto the stone, something Ryan couldn't quite make out. The man's movements were deliberate, controlled, yet his presence felt unnatural, like something wasn't quite right. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The figure finished and stepped back. That's when Ryan saw the name etched into the stone. Daniel Wren. He had never heard of Daniel Wren. The name was unfamiliar, but the fear was real. Ryan crept closer, barely able to breathe, and saw something that made his stomach churn. The name was fresh. The stone had been untouched just hours before, but now it was as though the name had been carved in mere minutes. Ryan knew he had to find out who Daniel Wren was. He couldn't just walk away anymore, not now that the name was there. He turned quickly, but as he did, he heard a whisper, a soft, almost inaudible murmur of words behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. The figure, the man who had carved the name, was gone. Ryan's mind raced. He had to find answers. But when he spoke to the townsfolk the next day, no one knew a Daniel Wren. They all gave him blank looks, even when he described the figure standing in front of the memorial. They hadn't seen anyone. It wasn't until Ryan dug deeper into the town's records that he found something unsettling. Daniel Wren had once lived in Pinewood, and he had died decades ago. But his name had never been placed on the memorial. It was a mystery that only deepened with time. The names kept coming. Every few weeks, without fail, a new name appeared, always fresh, always crisp, and always on that same memorial stone. Ryan, driven by a mixture of fear and fascination, visited every time. And each time he saw something new, a name would appear. Then, a few days later, the person would be gone. Daniel Wren, it turned out, had been a businessman who vanished without a trace in 1962. The police had never found his body. Then, the next name, Lucy Klein, was a woman who disappeared just last year. A car accident, they said, but her body was never recovered. The last name, Charlie Stevens, was a local farmer who had been declared dead after a tragic fall from a barn loft. Yet his body had never been found either. Ryan's suspicions grew darker. Could it be that each name represented someone who had vanished? Had they been forgotten by the town, their stories lost to time? Or is there something else at play? One cold, moonless night, Ryan found himself drawn back to the memorial, unable to resist. This time, he wasn't alone. He could feel the weight of eyes upon him. Someone was watching, but when he turned, no one was there. The name, Emily Park, was freshly carved, but as Ryan stared at the new addition, something caught his eye. A shadow just behind the stone moved. Ryan's heartbeat quickened. He took a hesitant step back, but the shadow stepped with him, mirroring his every move. Then, without warning, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. His feet felt like lead. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. The air around him thickened, pressing down with a weight that was almost suffocating. The whisper again, faint but clear. "We've been waiting for you." The last thing Ryan saw before he lost consciousness was the figure, the cloaked man, standing behind him, his hand reaching out, tracing the outline of Ryan's name on the memorial stone. The names continued to appear, and Ryan never made it home. Every year, on the anniversary of the death of Jonathan Weaver, a strange phenomenon occurs in the small town of Ashbrook. The tomb of Jonathan, a beloved local figure from the early 1900s, bleeds. But it's not just any bleed. It is a thick, dark crimson, slowly seeping from the cracks of the stone, staining the ground beneath. Those who witness it claim that it's not only the blood that's chilling, but the unsettling sense of foreboding that hangs in the air when it happens. It started as a rumor, whispered among the townsfolk in hushed tones during the summer of 1923. No one spoke of it openly. After all, how could anyone explain such a grotesque event? But then, as the years went by, it became undeniable. Jonathan Weaver, a local philanthropist who died in a mysterious car accident, had left behind a tombstone that was as lavish as it was imposing, a tribute to a man whose family had deep pockets and a long legacy. But it was not just the size of the stone that set it apart. His was the only grave in Ashbrook with ornate carvings and intricate inscriptions, strange symbols that no one seemed to understand. The first time the blood was noticed, it was by Marion Lambert, a young girl who had been playing near the cemetery with her brother. Her eyes widened when she saw the blood trickling down the base of Jonathan Weaver's tombstone, pooling around the ground beneath it. She screamed, calling out to her brother, who turned just in time to see the same thing. By the time the local constable arrived, the blood had already vanished, as if it had never been there at all. For months, people dismissed it as a trick of the light, an optical illusion caused by the weather, or perhaps some kind of strange reaction between the stone and moisture. But then, the next year it happened again, on the exact same date. The blood didn't just seep, it poured, flowing from the crevices of the tomb like some kind of living thing, as though Jonathan himself was reaching out from the grave. People gathered around, frozen in fear, their hearts pounding in their chests. Some cried out to God, others rushed to get the authorities, but no one dared approach the tomb itself. The blood soaked into the earth, and the atmosphere grew heavy, oppressive, as if something was watching. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the blood stopped. The tomb was dry again, and the townspeople slowly left, the whispers growing louder with each passing year. By the time 1943 came around, no one dared speak openly of the tomb's strange bleeding. Some claimed it was the result of old, forgotten magic, a curse, perhaps, placed on Jonathan Weaver in the years before his death. Others believed it was a tragic accident, and the blood was somehow linked to the anniversary of his passing. But no one could explain why it always bled on the same date. One year, in 1951, a local historian named Margaret Cartwright became obsessed with the mystery. She had spent years researching the history of Ashbrook and had come across something that intrigued her, a strange document in the town archives that mentioned the Weaver family's involvement in a secret society. Margaret believed this could be the key to unlocking the mystery of the Bleeding Tomb. On the night of the anniversary, she ventured to the cemetery alone. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and her notebook, she made her way through the rows of graves, her steps echoing in the silent air. When she reached Jonathan's tomb, she hesitated, her heartbeat quickening. The tombstone loomed before her like a sentinel, its shadow stretching long across the cemetery. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, it began. The blood seeped from the cracks once more, slow at first, then faster, until it began to pool at the base. Margaret gasped, stepping back, but she couldn't take her eyes off it. The blood was thick, dark, almost as though it was alive. But it wasn't the blood that terrified her the most. It was the words that began to appear on the stone, written in the same dark crimson liquid, as if Jonathan Weaver's tomb had a message to send. The words were cryptic, twisted, and seemed to shift as they appeared. "This is my price," they read. "I will return. This is the price of the pact." The words burned themselves into Margaret's mind. She stood there, rooted to the spot, as the blood stopped flowing and the words slowly faded back into the stone. The next morning, Margaret went to the local archives, desperate to understand what she had witnessed. What she found chilled her to the core. Jonathan Weaver had been involved in a secret society known as the Eternal Circle, a group rumored to have made a pact with forces far darker than anything the town could comprehend. The agreement, as she pieced together from old letters and journals, was that Jonathan's family would receive unimaginable wealth and power. But in exchange, they had to pay a price that would continue long after Jonathan's death. Margaret was terrified of what this meant. She returned to the grave that night, hoping to find answers, but the blood had already begun to flow again. This time, she could hear whispers, faint voices carried on the wind. They sounded like Jonathan, but also like something far older, something that had been bound to the tomb for centuries. "Your soul will never be free," the voice whispered, as though it were speaking directly to her. "You've awoken the pact. The blood is the price of your curiosity." Margaret fled from the grave, but she couldn't escape the feeling that something was following her, watching her every move. The next day, the blood had vanished, but her life was never the same. For years, she avoided the cemetery. But every anniversary of Jonathan Weaver's death, she would hear rumors that the blood had returned. People would speak of it, but no one would approach the tomb. Everyone knew the price of curiosity. Everyone knew better than to seek answers from a grave. And so, the years passed, and the tomb continued to bleed. Every year, without fail, as the pact continued its eerie cycle. No one dared to break the silence. No one dared to speak of what they knew. Jonathan Weaver's tomb would continue to bleed, as it always had, and the curse would live on forever in the small, forgotten town of Ashbrook. But perhaps there's still some who wonder in the dark corners of the night. What would happen if the blood is ever allowed to flow, just one drop too many?